You've seen the prices in the supermarket too. Unbelievable, right? In fact, they could get a lot worse, and not just here. It was 3 months ago, last Tuesday, that Russia invaded Ukraine. Thought it could knock it over in a few days. Instead, the Russian army was smashed, a quarter of it lost, knocked out, made useless. And now Russia's pulled back from the north and northeast of Ukraine and is fighting instead in just the east and southeast. It's almost a stalemate. But Russia is desperate not to lose and is now playing chicken with the rest of the world, hoping to stop it from helping Ukraine, sending arms, things like that. And it has grabbed most of Ukraine's coast and shut down shipping in and out of the country. And that means stopping ships taking food from Ukraine to the rest of the world. Ukraine is in fact a big food exporter, big exporter of wheat and corn, sunflower oil, particularly fertilizer, but it can't get most of that stuff out now. And with exports from Russia also strangled by the war, the United Nations and world leaders are warning of a food crisis.
The global food crisis is made worse by Russia's blocking Ukraine from exporting its millions of tons of grain. And also, as long as Russia continues the war, the United States will work with our partners to help lead a global response, because it's going to affect all parts of the world.
Joining me to tell us what's really going on over there is Jack Keane, a retired American four-star general who was Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He's now chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. General Jack Keane, thank you so much for joining us again. It is 3 months ago, since last Tuesday in fact, that Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, we've gone through the whole range of emotions. At first we thought Ukraine would fall over in days. They fought like tigers. They pushed the Russians back. Then we thought Ukraine could win. But now the Russians have regrouped and they seem to be making slow progress, expensive progress, but still progress on the Eastern Front. How worried should we be?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, their campaign in the north against Kyiv and Kharkiv, both of those have failed miserably. And they focused their forces in a much smaller area in the Donbass region. And overall, that campaign also began to stall. And as such, what they did, the western part of the campaign in the Donbass region, in the so-called Donetsk Republic, they have stopped their offensive operations against that. And they have narrowed the area down even smaller to focus in the Luhansk province and to focus principally against a major city in the Luhansk province, which is Severodonetsk. And as such, they've made some incremental progress. I agree with you. But certainly nothing on the scale, Andrew, that their plan called for, and they're considerably behind in their execution. And the reason is much of the similar problems we've had before. Their ground maneuver forces, armor and infantry, are weak, and they're not particularly well led, and the morale is not good. Their artillery forces are very good, and it is the artillery that is helping them to make this incremental progress that we're seeing.
It's an even greater horror in its scale that's been exposed by an extraordinary hack into the police files of the communist dictatorship of China. Now, we already know, as I've shown on the show, that the Chinese Communist Party is committing a terrible crime in its mainly Muslim province of Xinjiang in China's west. It has locked up what we estimate to be 1 million Muslim Uyghurs to re-educate them, to be loyal to China, to be less, Muslim, less Uyghur. But we haven't had many faces to put to this cultural genocide, nor have we learned the full scale of what China is doing. Until now. An astonishing breakthrough. Adrian Zenz is the Director of China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington and is an advisor to the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. Now, Zenz has today published explosive files hacked from Chinese government websites that include around 2,900 pictures of Uyghurs arrested by China and sent for re-education or punishment or slave labour. And when you see these faces, you can tell that China has been lying about what it's actually doing in Xinjiang. Now, it's been saying, well, look, all it's doing is just fighting Islamist extremists and terrorists. But when you see these Uyghurs, including teenagers as young as 14, like this girl. And when you also see how old other detainees are, a woman in her 70s, for instance, others in their 60s, you know this is not about terrorism. This is cultural genocide. Now, other photos that have been hacked show how police treat these prisoners, at least how they treat them when they know the boss is looking, and how they use cameras to spy on other Muslims in mosques. And then there are the documents. To explain what all this tells us, I am joined by Adrian Zenz. Adrian Zenz, thank you so much for joining me, and congratulations on this amazing story that you've been able to produce. How did you get this information?
This information was passed to me, which is not the first time, because I have now for several years specialized in researching and analyzing and authenticating Chinese government documents, both public and internal.
And it comes from a hack into, among other things, a hack into the computer systems of Chinese police and others. Is that correct?
That is correct. It comes from external penetration into computers, not somebody from the government leaking it. And that's also the reason why the material is very direct, very blunt, and it's really files that we've never seen. Probably a lot of officials don't necessarily have access to some of these files.
Well, the Liberals have already been proved right on two warnings about Labor they gave during the election on boats and on China. One, on the very day of the election, a boat of asylum seekers from Sri Lanka tried their luck. The second in days. Lured, were they, by the idea that a new Labor government's going to be softer? And two, turns out also correct, China did want Labor to win the election. China's Premier has now sent Anthony Albanese personal congratulations at his win and hinted it could take us out of the deep freeze if Albanese was just a little bit nicer than Scott Morrison. He was saying the Chinese side's ready to work with the Australian side to review the past, look into the future and uphold the principles of mutual respect and mutual benefit. But on both these issues, Anthony Albanese also proved the Liberals wrong. The boat people already sent home. Okay. The Chinese Communist Party, they got a slap. You see, Albanese has gone to Japan for a meeting with the US, Japan and India called the Quad, and immediately signed a deal that China just as immediately damned, a trade deal between 13 countries to help counter the threat of the communist regime. And Albanese was polite but cool on the Chinese Premier, sending him a message and an olive branch.
I have received now a letter of congratulations from Premier Lee, as I have from other world leaders, and I welcome that. We will respond appropriately in time when I return to Australia.
The good news from the election is that you can't buy our democracy. Billionaire Clive Palmer spent nearly $100 million trying to get his party elected. Amazing amount. Result, total flop. Not one seat. In fact, even in Queensland, Palmer's home state, he's being beaten in the race for the final Senate seat by the Legalised Cannabis Party. Now, it's true, One Nation's Pauline Hanson, she's going to win in the end, that last seat, but this still is the best Queensland result for this Legalised Cannabis Party. And joining me is its party president, plus the president of Nimbin's Hemp Embassy, Michael Balderstone. Michael, I guess neither of us ever thought that you would be on the Bolt Report, but I'm so glad to see you. Clive Palmer spent nearly $100 million. What did you spend?
Maybe, well, the fees to get everyone registered were probably 30 grand, and we maybe had another 20. So on the campaign, we wouldn't have spent 20 grand.
So what does that tell you? Your 70,000 tops against his 100 million. What does that tell you?
I think, I think it was very straightforward for people. They see the name Legalised Cannabis. Sure, there was quite a movement away from the major parties, but the word is out there on cannabis now, and a lot of people are using it. They'd like to be able to grow their own at home because it's very expensive, the legal one, and you can't drive, Andrew. So there's a lot of a lot of anger. It's about the driving laws, where even if people have got legal medical cannabis through a doctor, you're still not allowed to drive. That's a big problem.
Now, Kosha, Albanese has not mentioned cost of living pressures in his victory speech. He did say, look, he'd try to get productivity up and wages, but cost of living pressures didn't mention. I actually think they're going to be one of his biggest threats. What do you see coming down the highway that could throw this government sideways?
This one, Andrew, is interesting because I read his speech, the transcript in its entirety, and it had the obligatory thanking the traditional custodians of the land, talking about his personal story growing up with a single mother, heralding the multiculturalism benefits of the Australian electorate, etc., and not a word about cost of living, as you mentioned. And I think the reason for that is it is a cut and dry political calculation that he and his counterparts in liberal democracies everywhere are making, and that is really deprioritizing their traditional base of the working class and the labor class, for whom this cost of living really strikes at the heart of their household much more steeply, and moving towards a different coalition of millennials, new minorities, suburban women, elites, etc., that don't actually have a lot in common. But if they can successfully stitch that coalition together, and people have done that in other liberal democracies, they can actually deprioritize the working class and the issues that matter to them, such as the cost of living. So I think it's a cut and dry political calculation, and I'm not surprised that he did not touch on it in his speech for that reason.
Anthony Albanese could finally sleep in this morning after winning the election, after 6 weeks of hard campaigning, and then going to a big meeting of the Quad in Japan. But for Peter Dutton, the campaigning just goes on. The former Defence Minister today started his big blitz to sell himself as the new Liberal leader, even if the formal vote is yet to be held. And I thought his pitch actually was spot on, saying that he could now show his softer side, but more importantly, stressing a return to Liberal values.
I've learned a lot from the leaders I've served under, and I believe that we can win the next election, but there's a lot of work between now and then, and the Liberal Party has to get back to being the Liberal Party and being the broad church, and we're not the moderate Conservative Party, we're not the Conservative moderate party, we are the Liberal Party. But I do want people to see, the complete character that I am, not just what they've seen through sound grabs when I'm talking about, boats or all sorts of different issues, which are, difficult issues.
Of course, what Liberal values means has been a bit up for grabs, but I understand Dutton to mean that it's going to stand very firmly for things like opportunity, freedom, tolerance, handing power to people, not politicians, and focusing on the battlers, because cost of living, I'll say it again, is going to be a huge issue by the next election. Ross, I see an ugly future ahead, and I'm not blaming the Labor government, although I think it's going to make it worse by too much spending and by too much more of the green policies that have helped get us into this mess. But today I went to the shops to buy a nice steak to cook for a guest after this show. Scotch fillet, thought nothing but the best. $68 a kilo. I've never seen prices like that before. Petrol, $1.90 today, even after, with fuel excise being temporarily halved. I got a bunch of tomatoes to make a tomato sauce, $25. And we've got electricity prices rising and rising. We've got interest rates rising. Ross, I sense that we are hurtling into a cost of living crisis.
Do you know something? What you're talking about right there is inflation. Now, everybody is seeing it, everybody is feeling it. And so a few things have got to happen. Either, number one, people's wages have got to rise, and there's a shortage of labour. We've got unemployment at 3.9% and probably heading to 3.5%. And if you've got a shortage of labour, well, then the price of labour will rise, and that will add to this inflation story. You've got the price of goods that are rising in price, partly as a result of the cost of electricity, partly the cost of petrol, partly the cost of food around the world is rising as a result of the Russia-Ukraine situation. The problem here is we somehow thought we were different, that we would escape all of the worries from the rest of the world. But when you see the UK closing in on double-digit inflation, the US above 8% right now and having to raise interest rates very sharply, the real problem is, as it's been said at the Bank of England, they're now on a narrow path to try and avoid recession as they raise interest rates.
Now we've got more than 200 employees of one of the world's biggest publishers, Simon & Schuster, people whose lives should be devoted to the spread of ideas, have actually demanded the company not publish the memoirs of Mike Pence, Donald Trump's vice president, who actually seems a very decent man. Now, luckily, the company has told them to go take a hike. And Netflix has also defied its own staff who were complaining about an earlier special about, that mocked transgender activists. And they decided to go ahead and screen a performance of Ricky Gervais also having fun with trans activism. Here is some of it.
Not all women. I mean the old-fashioned ones. You know, the old-fashioned women. Oh, God. You know, the ones with wombs. Oh. Those dinosaurs. No, I love the new women. I know the new women. They're great, aren't they? You know, the new ones we've been seeing. The old-fashioned, they go like, oh, they want to use our toilets. Why shouldn't they use your toilets? For ladies. They are ladies. Look at their pronouns. What about this person isn't a lady? Well, his penis. Her penis, you bigot.
Now, I wonder what's going on here, Daisy. First, you had that special by Dave Chappelle on Netflix, caused a huge fuss. But now you've had Bill Maher, who's a left-wing comic in America, very prominent on TV, mocking the activism. And now this, by Ricky Gervais, also of the left. Is it rudeness? Is this rudeness to transsexuals? And is it now okay to be rude? Or is something else happening?
Look, for the record, Andrew, just on Ricky Gervais's piece specifically, I actually watched Ricky Gervais's comedy special last night. And let me tell you, his joke about trans activists is actually about the least offensive piece of material in the whole show. It is quite an extraordinary thing he's put together. It's very amusing, but if you watch it, no matter who you are, you're going to be made to feel very uncomfortable. So it is interesting, as you say, that Netflix has gone ahead and put this thing on, given how incredibly woke they've been in the past, like unbearably woke. Remember a couple of years ago, in the wake of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's terrible death, they got rid of Summer Heights High and Jonah from Tonga because they thought, because of the blackface element, of Chris Lilly, they were so woke. And now they've suddenly run this. I reckon, Andrew, something else is happening here. I think these companies have finally perhaps realised that the old saying of go woke and you'll go broke does have some truth to it. I mean, in the case of Netflix, for instance, I think they lost subscribers this year for the first time in like 10 years. People are simply tuning out for whatever reason. So they've realised that, look, while, okay, they'll cop some screaming from their activist employees and they'll cop some screaming on Twitter from the kind of woke Twitterati, they are a very noisy, intimidating bunch, but at the end of the day, they are a minority. So they must have worked out that the monetary gain and the eyes they'll gain from actually playing controversial but hugely popular comedians like Ricky Gervais and like Dave Chappelle and all the rest is actually greater than any kind of backlash they get from any kind of online activist or woke employee. So I really do hope we see a turning of the tides here, Andrew, but it is certainly a fascinating shift of gears.